Hello and welcome. Today we have with us Professor David Macdonald, who teaches at Queen's College, Kingston, Canada. David, welcome and good to have you with us.
Thank you.
You have written a lot about electricity in South Africa particularly, and you also talked about how this concept of services being priced, cost of services being recovered is actually starting a complete ideological change in the way infrastructure services are delivered. So what do you think is the real crisis? Is it of privatization or of the commercialization of this infrastructure services?
Well, they're linked, and it's not just the pricing per se that is the problem, although one could say that any form of pricing is a form of commodification, but then you can't take it out of the context of what kind of system it is either. So the Cubans, for example, put a price on electricity for residential consumers. And the intent there is partly to recover the costs of production, but it's priced in a social way that makes it largely accessible. They also price water, but it's effectively free. So that's a pricing mechanism which is not a market-based mechanism. So it's important that we distinguish what we mean by pricing, and if it's a marketized, commodified form of pricing or something else. What's happened in the last 15 or 20 years under neoliberalism is to try and ring fence, which is the term used in South Africa, where you figure out all of the costs associated with the production of a particular service by accounting for every last scrap of paper, quite literally. So if you do a photocopy on a machine that is also shared by the Department of Water or the Department of Health, you have to punch in your code and the cost of that particular photocopy goes to your department. It's down to that level of minute cost accounting. And then finance people use those details to figure out, okay, here's the actual cost of now producing this kilowatt hour of energy. So then the question is, well, are we going to just charge everybody a flat fee per kilowatt hour regardless of how much they consume because we figured this is our average cost of production? Or are we going to have a progressive or regressive form of pricing? A progressive form of pricing would say that the initial costs of production, or of consumption, would be low, or in fact, as it is in South Africa, with the first kilowatt hours of electricity per person per month is free. And then the price starts to jump in step tariffs after that.
In India, we call it the telescopic rate of tariff.
Telescopic rate of tariff, right. You have to look at that more carefully and say, well, how quickly or slowly does that price jump? And what are the incentives or disincentives, particularly at higher levels of consumption, to either reduce or promote the consumption of electricity? And is the tariff structure for residential consumers the same as it is for industrial consumers? So what often happens is they'll talk about the cost reflexive pricing, and they'll say that this is, of course, what the market needs, and people have to pay the cost of production because otherwise, how are we going to recoup our costs? But in the South African case, and indeed many cases, you look at these tariffs and you realize that they're actually charging industry less than the cost of production, often less than the average cost of production. And so it's residential consumers, and often the poorest of the residential consumers, who are subsidizing middle and upper income consumers and industry. So it's a very uneven distribution of cost recovery. So it's both a technical question about how you price these things, but it's a deeply political question around the kind of tariff structures that you decide to use.
So the ultimate analysis, any of these tariffs can be decided politically, though the accounting makes it appear as if it is not, and there is, in some sense, a quote-unquote a neutral way of accounting. And that's really what is reflected in all this tariffs.
There's a facade of objectivity.
Facade of objectivity behind what you really want to do.
Right.
But at the moment, what we seem to see is talking about full cost recovery is first arguing that this should be done commercially, the utilities should function commercially, and then saying that the private utilities actually perform more quote-unquote efficiently. And if it is commercial operations, the state really has no reason to do it and should be left to private utilities. This is really what is
yes and no. I think the commercialization or corporatization of electricity utilities has been done for two reasons. One has been to prepare the ground for privatization, because no private company wants to buy a utility where they don't know what the actual costs and revenues are. So there's been a political push over the last 20 to 25 years to financially ring fence these utilities so that there is a sort of transparency on what it actually costs to produce something. And then you can go to a private company and say, look, here's what it costs and here's how much money you can make, and often sweet deals are made to guarantee rate of return on profit. But you almost have to sort of commercialize and corporatize before any private company is going to be interested in buying. So the question is always, well, are you corporatizing here simply in preparation for privatizing? But what's also happening is just a kind of inculcation of neoliberalism and marketized managerial ethos and skills, and maintaining the publicness of these things. So they remain publicly owned and managed, but they're run effectively like private businesses. And often management is paid based on whether or not the corporation, as it's now called, is generating a surplus or making a loss. And so you start to see salaries in the public sector with the CEOs now. They're no longer managers, they're CEOs and so on. These public salaries like private sector salaries. And so you introduce a whole new management ethos through the mechanism of a new accounting system and financing system, which completely distorts things. But these are still publicly owned and publicly managed entities. And so the government can say, no, we're not privatizing. But in effect, these companies are de facto private. And in the South African case, going back to your original question, Eskom, which is the national electricity provider, is fully corporatized and now acts like a very aggressive multinational corporation reaching out into the rest of Africa, and had at one point established Eskom Inc. to go out and actually try and find private sector contracts. They've since sort of come back with their tail between their legs, realizing that they weren't actually up to the task and there wasn't much out there for them to privatize. But it just begs the question of, if you're not simply preparing for privatization, are you simply just going to act like a private company in any event and cherry pick and make profits on the backs of poor people?
You've also written about how electricity and capitalism, in some sense, are intertwined, particularly in the developments in South Africa. So do you think that there is something intrinsic, that capitalism needs electricity sector to develop in a particular way for its own development?
Well, to be honest with you, I came up with the term because I thought it sounded nice and it would be a good title for a book. And then I started to think more about it, and I thought, actually, it is true. Capitalism actually is increasingly dependent on electricity. Now, you could write books called oil capitalism, and in fact there are a couple of books out there with the title Oil Capitalism. You could talk about water capitalism, you could perhaps have talked about wood capitalism or plastic capitalism, but I think there's a case to be made increasingly in an electronic world that we live in, where the world would grind to a halt without electricity. I mean, we would grind to a halt without oil as well. But in some ways, I think, and this is a little, looking into the future through a crystal ball. Thank you. So it's speculating, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if 20, 30, 50 years from now, we've replaced oil with something else, and electricity has become, in fact, the grease of the capitalism engine. I think there's a case to be made to say that capitalism is, in fact, a form of electric capitalism. Now, having said that, the book is about Africa, and less than 25% of Africans have access to electricity, and yet are subject to the rules and regulations of capitalism. So, they don't enjoy the benefits of capitalism, but they suffer the discipline of it. And so, they are not electric capitalists.
Also talked about how the power grid could, in effect, become a vehicle for sub-imperialism or imperialist expansion of the South African economy. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Well, it is happening, and the subtitle of the book is Recolonizing Africa on the Power Grid. And there's some maps in the book that show, to some extent, ones that are already built, regional power pools, but the ones that they're contemplating out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which look like the old railway lines of the 1800s, where the Brits and the French and the Portuguese and the Germans and the Dutch built railway lines not to benefit the African population, but to bring out minerals, transport goods
Help
in.
their extractive economy.
Help the extractive economy. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the local population. And railways are still important in Africa, but it's moved on to boats and planes. But I think this electricity grid, both existing and planned, it just looks like a different version of the railway grids of the 19th century.
Thank you, David. This has been interesting, and we hope that you come back to India again, that we can have further discussions.
Thank you.
Thanks.